Hey, what's up everybody? Recently I had to change the starter on my TSX and I was able to film it for you guys. In this video I'm going to cover the removal of the starter, installing your new starter, putting everything back together, and then I'll have some additional tips and information at the end of the video. Unfortunately, the starter is buried underneath the intake manifold. On my car you can see the starter's shiny sticker peeking out. So we're going to have to remove the intake tube, the throttle body, and the intake manifold. And then we'll have access to the starter. It sounds like a lot, but I'll guide you through it. It's a lot easier to do this if you put the car on jack stands, so do this first. You have to disconnect the negative battery terminal. Let's take a look at the intake tube. We have to disconnect the vacuum tube, the breather pipe, the intake air temperature sensor, and then loosen the intake tube clamp at the bottom near the throttle body. Disconnect the vacuum tube. Disconnect the breather pipe. Disconnect the intake air temperature sensor connector. Loosen the intake tube clamp. I had to loosen it some more. Now you can remove the intake tube. Let's have a look at the throttle body. You have the throttle actuator connector, the evap canister hose, a harness clamp at the bottom, and two water hoses at the bottom. The OEM manual says to disconnect the two lower bypass hoses and plug them. I did not have to disconnect the coolant lines because I previously did the throttle body bypass mod. This is where you insert a 90-degree brass elbow or plastic elbow. It's probably like a 3/8 size, and you connect the two hoses to each other using the elbow. So with my cooling hoses out of the way, let's continue. Disconnect the evap canister hose on the throttle body. Disconnect the throttle actuator connector. Don't yank from the cables. Press the tab on the top in the middle and wiggle it out. Now pinch the harness clamp to move it out of the way. Remove the manifold cover. Now let's look at the intake manifold. It's held in by 3 bolts and 2 nuts. It has a metal gasket on the top. You can reuse yours or buy a new one. There's a brake booster vacuum hose up front. Up top, there's a wire harness attached with 2 bolts, and the harness connects to the map sensor. Down below, there's a manifold bracket at the bottom, and there's another harness attached to that bracket at the bottom of the manifold. And to the rear, on the left side, there's a vacuum hose behind the intake manifold. Remove the brake booster vacuum hose. Remove the bolt that holds in the harness bracket at the top. Unplug the map sensor connector. To remove the harness holder on the front, I realized that I needed to remove the coolant reservoir tank. It's just 2 bolts. And the tube. And then it comes right out. Okay, back to the harness holder bolt. There's a harness attached to the lower manifold bracket. Pinch the clamp out of the way if it's connected. Now remove the harness connector by pressing a little tab on the back side of it. It's facing the rear of the car. Press the tab and slide it to the right. The lower intake manifold bracket bolt is challenging because it's hard to see and reach. The bolt is right under where you disconnected that wire harness. Bring your head low at the driver end of the radiator and use a light to see that bolt. Here's a view from under the car. First, we'll crack loose that bolt and then we'll unthread it by hand. To loosen the bolt, I use my 3/8 ratchet with a shallow 12mm socket. With your ratchet on your right hand, insert your right hand between the upper radiator hose and the radiator fan and guide the ratchet to the left towards the bolt. With your left hand, help hold the socket firm and flat on the bolt as you knock it loose. Once it's loose, bring out your right hand with a socket wrench. Now you're going to unthread the bolt by hand. One hand is going to pull the radiator hose towards you, and the other hand is going to unthread the bolt. I tried to film this, but I had no luck. Okay, moving right along. Now remove the thin vacuum hose behind the passenger side of the manifold. Reach in and disconnect it. Now remove the 2 nuts and 3 bolts that hold in the intake manifold. You'll notice that the 3 bolts are identical. Carefully remove the intake manifold while keeping the wire harness out of the way and to your right. Behold the intake manifold. With the intake manifold out of the way, now you can see the starter. Let's have a look at the starter. It's held in by 2 bolts. It has 2 connectors and 3 locations where you'll disconnect a wire harness. Push down on the plastic tab as you pull the harness towards you. Pinch this clip to move it off the starter. Now disconnect the knock sensor. The 2 starter wires have rubber boots covering the terminals. Starting with the top one, peel back the boot. The nut on top is a 12mm nut. Carefully get it out and lift the ring terminal. Peel back the smaller connector and remove the spade terminal. The top rear bolt is long and has a 14mm head. The lower front bolt has a 17mm head. As you unthread the lower front bolt, the starter will separate from the engine and start to fall. With one hand, hold the starter flush as you unthread the bolt with the other hand. Now you can take the starter out. Behold the engine flywheel. AutoZone wanted about $160 for a Duralast starter, but I found a $60 starter on Amazon with some good reviews and no core charge. And now I just put everything back together, guys. Alright, I'll quickly go over some tips on putting everything back together. Insert the starter and hold it with one hand flush while you thread in the bolts with your other hand. Torque the upper bolt to 33 foot-pounds. Torque the lower bolt to 47 foot-pounds. Insert the spade terminal and cover the terminal with the boot. Insert the ring terminal with the crimped side up and carefully thread in the nut. Tighten it down and cover the terminal with the boot. Reconnect the knock sensor and fasten the wire harness here and here. Reinsert the intake manifold loosely. Tilt the manifold and reach in behind the manifold and reconnect the vacuum line. So before threading in any bolts on the manifold, remember that there's a bolt that attaches to the lower bracket. Get that one first. With your left hand, pull the radiator hose towards you, and with your right hand, you're going to thread in the bolt. Wiggle that manifold bracket if needed. And while you're there, reconnect that lower wire harness. It just clips into place. Now you can insert the 3 bolts and 2 nuts on the intake manifold. Torque those to 16 foot-pounds in a crisscross pattern. Replace the brake booster vacuum hose at the front of the intake manifold. Replace the wire harness upper bolt and the one on the front. Reconnect the map sensor. Moving along to the throttle body, reconnect the throttle actuator connector. Reconnect the evap canister hose on the throttle body. Lastly, reconnect the water bypass hoses. Now replace the intake air duct, reconnect the vacuum hose, reconnect the breather pipe, reconnect the intake air temperature sensor, and fasten the intake tube clamp. Don't forget to put back the coolant reservoir, and last, reconnect your negative battery terminal. After installing the starter, make sure you check all the tubes, the hoses, and the connectors, and make sure everything is installed properly. You want to refill the radiator with engine coolant and then bleed the air from the cooling system. Because I already did the throttle body bypass mod, I didn't have to bleed the air from my cooling system. Alright, start her right up. If you want to avoid bleeding the cooling system after you do this job, you can remove the throttle body from the intake manifold. It's held in by 2 nuts and 2 bolts. Remove the bolts and nuts and you can leave the water hoses connected to the throttle body. The only problem is that you're going to have to tear that throttle body paper gasket. So if you're going to go this route, purchase a new gasket for the throttle body. And when you put those nuts and bolts back, they are torqued to 16 foot-pounds. The first time I removed my reservoir tank, 1 bolt was seized, so I had to cut off a piece of the plastic with a utility knife in order to get it out. So you may run into this issue. The starter bolts were really stuck, so I recommend using some PB Blaster to loosen those bolts up. And be careful with your knuckles. I use these gloves when I want to protect my knuckles. Alright guys, check the video description for more information. If you have any questions, leave them in the comment section. If this video was helpful, please give it a thumbs up, and I'll see you in the next one.